Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Jasper Dent. I'm the Events and Floor Assistant Manager here at McNally Robinson, Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and homeland of the Métis. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Flying a Gooney Bird in Canada's North, a Bush Pilot Adventures by Dorrin Wallace with Deana Driver, published by DriverWorks Ink. Thank you so much to both Dorrin and Deana for being here tonight and for working with us at McNally Robinson to make this event happen. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so there's a web camera up to your right here. Just be mindful. No one's going to stand in front of it, it seems, but that's something to keep in mind. I'd also like to take this moment to ask you all to silence or turn off your phones for the duration of the event. If you'd like to buy copies of Flying a Gooney Bird, we've got some up here on the signing table, and we've also got some on the desk by where you first came in. You're welcome to get your book signed before you purchase it. We just ask that you please do remember to stop by the cash desk on your way out. And now, to start us off this evening, I'd like to invite Deana Driver, who is the co-author and publisher of this book, to come up and say a few words about how she met Dorrin and how this all got started. Everyone, please give her a warm welcome.
Thanks, Jasper. That's great. Thank you to McNally Robinson for having us here for this special event. And thank you for all of your attendance tonight and your support. As Jasper mentioned, I'm co-author of this book and publisher of this book. And I was going to say I live in Regina, but I live in Emerald Park, just east of Regina. And I'm a book publisher and an author and a retired journalist. So my background revolves around telling true stories of Saskatchewan and Canadian people. And in 2001, I fell into the world of book publishing by accident. Somebody, a journalist friend, approached me and said that the people at the Weyburn Inland Terminal were looking for help in telling their story of their first 25 years in business. And they asked him if he knew anybody who could write a book. He told them I could, so he told me to call them. And I thought, pardon me? And so I blame the Weyburn Inland Terminal for the thousands of books that I have worked on, and not worked on, but have copies of. And this is one of the many fabulous stories that I have been privileged to be part of. So this is my first book as a co-author, which is pretty exciting. And I thank Dorrin for trusting me with his story. The way that I met this gentleman behind me was in 2019, I was looking for stories of prairie pilots, Canadian Saskatchewan aviation, prairie people, and I ended up publishing this book called Flight Stories of Canadian Aviation, Volume 1. And I came here to Saskatoon and I met Janet Kime at Mitchinson Flying Service. And she said, you have to come across to the Aviation Museum and meet Dorrin Wallace. So we literally walked across the tarmac and she pulled Dorrin out of his office, I think literally down the stairs, and introduced the two of us. And I said, explain to Dorrin what I was wanting to do was collect stories of different pilots' experiences. And I said, could you please tell me some stories of your work, in the aviation industry? Because I didn't know very much of anything other than Dorrin was the president of the Saskatchewan Aviation Museum here in Saskatoon, which is very new at that time. It opened in 2018, and largely due to Dorrin's involvement in that process. And so when I said to him, please tell me your stories, he said, well, I could write my own book of stories. And I said, go ahead, please do that, but please tell me some stories first. So he did tell me a couple of stories that I was able to put into this book. And then, lo and behold, 2023, I hear from Dorrin that he has written some of his own life story, his biography. He sent it to me. I read it and sent it back and said, some pretty good stuff in here. Can you add this and can you add that? And can you think about this? Another year goes by, Dorrin's working on it some more. He sends me more stuff a year later. And I said, great stuff. It's getting better. And we need to talk about this and that. And at that point, I think it was last year. This is really awkward looking backwards for confirmation. I'm going to do this. I don't like this. Can I pull this out? Thank you. Appreciate that. That's very awkward. So I think it was last year that you and I sat down and had coffee and decided that we would co-author this book because of my journalism background and Dorrin's incredible storytelling ability. It just seemed like a pretty good match for the written word. And so that's what you have in this book is Dorrin's stories with my, I'm not going to say embellishment because it was my details and prompting him to add more details and prompting him to, tell us about this and tell us about that and what about that. And he had started writing this book with the plan to celebrate the people that he worked with for the 40 years in aviation in Saskatchewan and north of Saskatchewan, up in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Ontario, you were in Alberta, all of these places over 40 years. But my friend Mary Bishop at the back of the room is a Saskatoon author. You might know of her from the Tunnels of Time and Tunnels of Moose Jaw Adventure stories for kids and teens. But Mary lives here and she is one of the people who assisted with editing this book. And she said, no, she agreed with me that we need Dorrin to tell his story as part of how he met these people and how they impacted his life and he impacted theirs. And so we think we've got a pretty darn good book. There's number 3 on the wall out there that says so too. So we're pretty excited about being number 3 today on the nonfiction list for McNally Robinson booksellers in Saskatoon. That's a pretty neat accomplishment for a first-time author. So back to how he and I met. One of the other things that happened in 2019 when I met Dorrin was I also met this gentleman, Reg Crash Harrison, at about that same time. And Reg is 103 years old. He lives here in Saskatoon and he's a bomber pilot during the Second World War. And Reg crashed 4 times, survived 4 plane crashes during the war. And so when I met Reg, I wrote 5 short stories about his life for this first volume of Flight. But a few years later, I knew that I wanted to write another book. I hadn't written a book for 4 or 5 years. And so I ended up writing a biography of this gentleman's story. And that is also a very, very cool, inspiring biography. With Reg's story and with Dorrin's story, it was really important to have them tell their story, to have it be in their words, as though when you're reading it, you're hearing his voice. You're not hearing mine. You're hearing what he experienced and what he thought and the things that he went through. And so I'd like to take the opportunity to read the introduction that Dorrin wrote and I published. These are Dorrin's words. The first time I saw a DC-3 remains etched in my mind. I was in grade 12 at a Royal Canadian Air Cadet Flight Training Program in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and I was wowed at the immense size of this 24-passenger giant commonly referred to as the Gooney Bird. It was wider than 2 Cessna 150 training airplanes parked side by side, and longer than 2 of them put front to back. Its wheels were 4 feet high, and the cockpit was 12 feet in the air. I wondered what kind of person it would take to fly something so big. It never occurred to me that I could someday be that person. I was shy as a child, growing up on a farm in rural Saskatchewan. When I was in high school and it was time to make a speech in front of the entire class, I conveniently missed school on those days, too afraid to speak in front of a group. I preferred smaller groups of people, and I learned later in life to work through my introverted nature to be able to share my knowledge, opinions, and experiences, especially in aviation, with others. The day I saw my first DC-3 was the day that changed my life. I owe that DC-3 sitting on the tarmac in Prince Albert a debt of gratitude. It led me to a future in the aviation industry, doing jobs with little human interaction at times, but all variety of responsibilities and adventures for over 40 years. I flew more than 25,000 hours in all the Prairie provinces, Ontario, and Canada's 3 northern territories, and I enjoyed my work as both a pilot and an aircraft maintenance engineer, which is what he was before he became a pilot, and since and during. I flew for remote fishing camps and hunting lodges, explaining to guests that flying in a bush plane is not as hazardous as they might think, especially with a skilled pilot. I always encouraged guests to try something new, which led them to have even better experiences than they ever imagined, enjoying the beauty of the northern flora and fauna and the wildlife sightings. All my life, I made a habit of doing things other people said I couldn't do, starting at age 6 when I milked a cow for the first time and taught myself to ride the workhorse to our country school. My flying career was the same. In the early 1970s, I was the first person to land a DC-3 on Collins Bay, Fond du Lac, Key Lake, Clough Lake, and many other runways that had just been built in northern Saskatchewan. They were small, short, and rough airstrips, and others did not think they were suitable for a large airplane like the Gooney Bird. I proved them wrong. I did a lot of other things in aviation that other people had not done. I didn't necessarily agree with or follow other people's thought processes. I made up my own mind whether I could do a job safely. If I felt I could do it, I did. Sometimes the rules and regulations were set aside so I could accomplish the mission. I never had an accident in my 25,000 hours of flying, and I never received an infraction against my record. There were many times when I completed tasks that others cautioned could not be done, including opening the Saskatchewan Aviation Museum in Saskatoon ahead of schedule. My stubborn streak and hard work ethic helped to accomplish that. When I retired as a pilot with Points North Freight Forwarding in northern Saskatchewan in 1999, the staff gave me a plaque that listed my 10 favorite sayings. One of the sayings was, "Why not?" It's the way I chose to live my life, leading to many interesting, exciting, and scary moments along the way. Numerous guests who flew with me in Canada's north asked if I had ever thought of writing a book about my adventures in aviation. After letting the seed grow for many years, this is my effort at telling my story. The book is full of short stories, lots and lots, 106 to be exact. And each one of them talks about a situation, an event, a person, a series of events, all of them connected in some way to Dorrin's 40 years in aviation. One of the pieces that I chose to read a part of tonight is called Memorable Flights in the DC-3, and that's what the Gooney Bird is the DC-3, and it's named, the nickname Gooney Bird is for the DC-3, which is the C-47. Is that the American name for the military plane when he was in the military in the US? The DC-3 Gooney Bird is named after the albatross, known for its dependability and long flights without having to stop and refuel. So memorable flights in the DC-3 and the F-27. Dorrin wrote, I had many interesting experiences flying the larger airplanes over the years. One memorable trip was a routine freight run to Stony Rapids in the DC-3. I was holidaying at Emma Lake in northern Saskatchewan with my wife and children, plus her aunt and uncle from England. I had to go to the Norcan Air office in Prince Albert to check on something, so I took Diane, his wife's Uncle Sid, with me. When I got there, I discovered there was no pilot available to take a required trip to Stony Rapids. So, as Norcan Air's chief pilot at the time, I took that trip even though I was on vacation. My co-pilot was someone I had hired just for the summer. I had received complaints about his laziness, but I ignored those complaints because of his expected short term of employment. Having insufficient time to return Uncle Sid to Emma Lake, I strapped him into the jump seat and flew for 3 hours over bush and lakes to Stony Rapids. Uncle Sid was becoming concerned that he would never see civilization again. He also didn't understand how we managed to find this tiny airstrip 400 miles into the bush. After we landed, I unloaded the freight and instructed my co-pilot to gas up the airplane. He told me he didn't gas up airplanes. I corrected him and said he did do that job that day. 5 minutes later, this co-pilot fell off the DC-3 wing and broke one of his arms. A trip to the local nursing station resulted in a splint and painkillers that rendered him unable to perform his duties. The last laugh was on me that day as I had to gas the plane myself. Once again, I had to stretch the rules of aviation. We were not supposed to fly a DC-3 without a co-pilot. So rather than wait 4 hours for a replacement co-pilot to arrive in Stony Rapids, I put Uncle Sid into the co-pilot's seat. I showed him how to raise the undercarriage and we left for PA. A few years later, I found out that Uncle Sid had not told this story to anyone in England, I'm sure he thought his friends would think it was too bizarre to be believable. So that's one of the short stories about some of the people and some of the experiences that Dorrin had. There are many, many things that we could talk about and say today, but I want to turn it over to Dorrin to tell you some of his stories and some of his adventures, and then we will have time for question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Deana. I appreciate your kind words, and that is a true story. That's exactly what happened. We didn't want to be late for supper, or there was going to be a lot of trouble going on. Waters went under the bridge since I originally started flying, and a lot of strange things happened. Like Deana said, I did want to tell the story of about a lot of different people that I'd met over the years. You must remember, in the years that I flew, there was still white trappers in the north. There was fishermen. There was the tourist trade was tremendous in those days. I met a tremendous amount of people, and there was some characters, that put it that way. So I did work as many of them as I could into the book. Just as an example, one of these people that I met actually long before I started flying. I met him in 1960. I was doing some training on him on a J3 Cub at North Battleford. And he was a trapper from Cree Lake. Well, I didn't even know where Cree Lake was in those days. Anyway, I went and looked at the map and soon found out it was a long ways north. Anyway, this trapper was buying this airplane, so he had his own personal transportation to and from his cabin where him and his wife lived. So anyway, I was busy training this guy, and all of a sudden I come to work one morning and I said to the boss, I said, am I going to do some more training with him today? And he said, no. I said, well, why not? And he said, well, he took the airplane this morning, he's gone. I said, well, he wasn't ready to go flying yet. He said, doesn't matter, he was sick of training. So we never even knew if he got to Buffalo Narrows or got to Cree Lake or wherever he was going. We never heard. So there was no bad news, so we assumed he made it. I met this guy in 1967. 7 years later, I finally got to his cabin and met him and his wife. Of course, the airplane had long since gone. I mean, he did have a successful career flying this thing around, despite the fact he flew it drunk half the time. But he was partying so much, his wife finally said one day, the airplane goes or I go, take your choice. So he sold the airplane. But those two people were emblematic, typical of the kind of people that you met in those days. I can't remember where Leon was from, but his wife was from Big River, and she'd never been further north than Big River in her life. And when she first got to Cree Lake, she told me she used to, she'd been living in Saskatoon, that's right. She said the first couple of months she was living there, she kept hearing freight trains. And she said, and I knew there was none here, but they lived there for 20 odd years, fishing and trapping and doing whatever dikes to make a living. And it was one of the stops that I used to love to make, one of the places I used to like to overnight, because I always got fresh moose meat, canned moose meat, bannock, and there was usually some canned blueberries or something. The meals were great. And they really appreciated anything I did for them. And of course, on my trips back and forth home, fish from them, I mean, any errand they needed in town run, I would do that for them because they sure looked after me at the time. At any rate, flying has been good to me. I actually fell into it quite by accident. Deana told you a little bit about how I got started. I started as an apprentice aircraft mechanic at Prince Albert. And I really did have aspirations of going flying. But the one thing that really intrigued me was the people that do fly those airplanes. I mean, it was a given in those days that those people were all ex-Air Force, and I kind of had the thought you had to go that route, and you had to have that kind of training before you could ever attempt to fly these airplanes. But as I got to know these people better and better, as I'm rubbing shoulders with them, I find out they're no different than anybody else. Their IQ's no higher. They got no different skills than anybody else. So I thought, well, if those guys can do it, why can't I? So that started my thought process, and I finished my commercial license and moved to L'Orange, where there was more airplanes flying. And lo and behold, I did this simply because a lot of those guys were ex-World War II and they were all older, and you know, one of these days somebody's going to lose their medical. And as it turns out, it happened faster than I thought. I worked at Laurence for once in the summer of '65. We moved there back in the spring of '66, and I worked there for just a month or two. And I was working in the shop one morning. I'd already been there for 5 hours, and I was just going for coffee. And the base manager walked in and he said, "Did I hear you got a commercial license? Is that true?" And I said, "Yes, that's true." He said, "Well, do you think you could fly that thing?" And I said, "What are you pointing at?" And he said, "The 180 on float sitting out the end of the dock." I said, "Oh yeah, I can fly that." He said, "Well, go over to the fish pond, get a load of tubs, and go get a load of fish from White Moose Lake." So I did. I'd never flown a 180 before. I'd never flown an airplane with a constant speed prop. I had 5 or 6 hours on a J3 Cub in 1960 on float, so I had no float experience. And the training was zero. I just jumped in the airplane and went. And I got back, and there's a couple of gentlemen here from the next lake I went to, which was Wollaston. I got back and he said, "Do you want to do another trip?" I said, "Well, first he asked me how I made out." I said, "Well, I'm back, aren't I?" Okay, he said, "Well, you want to do another trip?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, I'll go to Wollaston. You got to take a passenger up there." So away I went. But thank God I had a passenger that was familiar with the North, and he was able to help me map reader. I don't think I found Wollaston. At any rate, that was my first day, and I progressed through the organization very quickly, and fortunately, with my previous acquaintances that I had got to know in the company, namely the older pilots and the older engineers, and I'd sat and spent a lot of time having coffee with these guys and asking them about the tricks of the trade. That's what kept me alive, was the things that I learned from those people around a cup of coffee. And of course, I love to do the same thing today. I love to share my stories and my knowledge about flying with others. Over and above that, I guess we could tell you. What was I going to tell you?
You're going to tell them about flying the Gooney Bird for the first time.
Oh yeah,
as a pilot.
Yeah, DC-3 was another story. 2 or 3 of the airplanes that I flew in the North, I never did get training. I didn't get training. I got 10 minutes training on a Beaver. That was the only one I got any training on. Norseman, I jumped into it and flew it. Otter, I jumped into it and flew it. Some of the small twin engine airplanes, I jumped into and flew them.
Which couldn't happen today, right?
No. With today's regulations, you got to have a minimum of about 10 hours of training with an approved pilot in order to have this mission accomplished, and maybe ride with an MOT inspector. But at any rate, back when we moved back to Prince Albert from the North, and I got checked out on the DC-3 as co-pilot. Now the checkout was pretty poor. I knew more about the systems of that airplane because I'd worked in the shop than the guy that checked me out knew. So all I had to worry about was flying the airplane. Well, it flew like a great big Cessna, so I was okay. So I started out flying this airplane as co-pilot, and I got pulled off the airplane very frequently because I could fly all the rest of the smaller airplanes and the rest of the co-pilots couldn't. So I wasn't getting a lot of time, but I was getting some time. And I come to work one morning and I was flying with this older captain, and one of the engineers walked by me and he said, "Has that guy been drinking?" I said, "Oh, probably." He said, "What makes you say that?" I said, "Well, he's drunk all the time." So he said, "Well, he's not going north. We were doing the Uranium City Sched." So I said, "Well, do what you got to do." So he phoned the president, and the president said, "Well, fire that guy on the spot." So he said, so he came back and looked, and there was no other captains in town. So he phoned the president back again and he said, "There's no other captains in town, and the airplane's loaded and it's ready to go." He said, "Well, finding who's in the right seat of the airplane today?" And he said, "Wallace." He said, "Well, go find another co-pilot and move Wallace over to the left-hand seat and send him off." So that's what happened. I moved in the left-hand seat, and away I went. And we had bad weather that day. We had to do an instrument approach every place we went. And I'll tell you, by the time I got back to Prince Albert, I thought I'd been wrung through a washing machine for 2 days. But nevertheless, we made the grade and carried on.
What was your longest flight in, like, the flight time?
The longest flight I ever did, and I was talking to this gentleman last night at another event. We took off one day in the Arctic. We were up there working for a firm called Pan Arctic, and we were moving mining supplies to their oil rigs, various places in the Arctic Islands. And we got out of bed one morning and we put in a 20-hour duty day, which consisted of, I can't remember how many hours of flying, 12 or 14 hours. Anyway, we were on our way to a hotel and somebody come along with an emergency. So we went and did that trip. By the time we got to bed, we had done 24 hours and 30 minutes airtime over the period of about 36 hours.
Again, something that couldn't happen today,
Yeah. Nowadays, if you did that, somebody'd hang you.
right? One of the stories that we talked about sharing was temperamental weather in the Northwest Territories. And you talk about being at Trophy Lodge, and there were boatloads of elderly people that you had to rescue because the weather changed. And you were flying a beaver up there?
Yes.
Yeah, and you had to go pick these people up and get them back, right?
Yeah. Well, that was a bad.
6 foot to 8 foot high waves.
Yeah, that was a bad day in the
It
Arctic.
was just a normal day for Dorrin.
We started the day by taking 3 or 4 loads of people out with the beaver. Because anything that was past 25 miles, rather than boat there, they would keep boats out in that part of the lake, and we would fly the guests out, and it saved them an hour or so boating. So I had 3 or 4 loads of people out that day, and about dinner time it started to blow. We had no access to weather forecasts, so we had no idea this was coming. But anyway, I saw this bad weather moving in. So I went to the manager and I said, I'm going to go right after lunch and start picking people up rather than wait till 5 o'clock. So I went up and picked up 1 load of people. I got them back. And by the time I went for the second load, it was really starting to blow. And they were out on an island way out in the middle of Great Bear Lake. And I was able to land in behind the island and pick them up and get out of there again. But in the meantime, there was another boat was reported missing. So on the way back, I looked for these guys, and sure enough, I found them in a little creek about not much wider than this room. And fortunately, the creek was straight into the wind, so I landed and picked those guys up. I was unable to turn the airplane around because it wasn't wide enough and the wind wouldn't allow me to, so I had to drift backwards with the engine running until I finally had enough room to get out of there. And I got out of there, and in the meantime, the weather had come down some more, and there was a line of hills I had to go over, and I had to hop up into the clouds, go over these hills, find a hole, come back down at the lodge, land, and I did that. Then I find out there's 2 boatloads of old folks out on the main part of the lake. Would I go look for them? So I gassed up again. I didn't put any more than the minimum amount of fuel on because I knew this was bad news, because by this time the wind was blowing 40, 50 miles an hour. And I got out there, and sure enough, they're on an island, maybe 4 times as big as this room. It never even had a tree on it. If I didn't pick them up that night, they weren't going to make the grade. So I landed and got in there, got them on board. The waves were so high at this point in time that I was able to take off in 3 waves. Now, you can appreciate this if you've ever been on the ocean. As waves get bigger, they get further apart. So the waves were quite a ways apart, but nevertheless, getting airborne in 3 waves, I don't know anybody that's ever done that. And we managed to get out of there and get these people home. Those 2 boats that were hauling these people around that day, they left, and they told me on the way home they lost sight of one another between when they were each in a valley of a wave. They couldn't see out of the boat over top of the crest of that wave. Anyway, we made it, and
We made it.
yeah,
We made it, he says.
it blew for 2 more days, and we weren't able to get through change day. But you know what? The cards got worked over, and the stories got worked over, and everybody managed.
Unbelievable. One of the most memorable visual stories that Dorrin told in the book, it won't leave me ever, I don't think, is when it was the DC-3 that you landed in a snowstorm in a whiteout, and you had to figure out, you didn't know how far you were from the shore, so you had to get out. And where were you, in Nunavut? And you had to walk backwards in the snowstorm to count his steps to figure out if he had enough room to take off in the whiteout. And he lost sight of the plane as part of this story, which, as a normal human being who doesn't fly planes, freaks me out badly. And he just did this, just normal.
Yeah, I had no choice. Where I'd landed on this lake, I couldn't see. And we were a quarter of a mile from the GPS from where we dropped off a couple previous loads, and I couldn't find them. And I couldn't turn the airplane around because it was blowing so hard. Now I didn't know how close I was to shore. And I know the lake was Ray Lake shore was surrounded by rocks. So I had to be airborne before I got to the lake shore. So hence I had to walk to the shore and find out how far it was. And in order to accomplish this, I had to walk backwards because the wind was blowing at least 50 miles an hour, and it was about minus 50. It was cold that day. And the co-pilots, when we had unloaded, we would throw a barrel out of the airplane, and I had two that day, and they would roll a barrel away and they'd jump in the airplane, and then the second guy would get out. If they stayed out there any longer than that, their cheeks were getting frostbitten. And both of them did wind up with frostbite that day. But at any rate, when I walked backwards to the shore, I just stood up my hood and I walked backwards until I finally got to shore. And as Deana said, I lost sight of the airplane, not about a quarter of the way to the shoreline. But I was walking straight into the wind, so I'm assuming that walking straight downwind now, the airplane's going to come into sight again. And it did. And I was sitting running. And I tell you, it was one of the happiest things I ever saw in my life when I saw that airplane.
Wow.
Anyway, we got in the airplane and it was warmed up and ready to go by this time. And that was one of the few times in my life I did a takeoff with an airplane, just looking straight at the instruments, because looking outside, you couldn't see anything, but just strictly an instrument takeoff. Anyway, we got made home.
You have questions? Does anybody have anything that they're wondering about? Yes?
I have another microphone I can put you here.
Hi, Dorrin, this is Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
Have you ever been stranded then and not able to take off and sleep in planes overnight?
You know, that's a good question. And I hate that expression, by the way.
The one you just used?
Yeah. It only happened to me twice. And the first time was when I got my commercial license. I rented an airplane at Prince Albert, and I had to go down to Regina to do my ride. And I got down there and it was too windy and the inspector wouldn't do the ride. And I had no money. So I had no choice but sit in the airplane for the night. And I got up.
Tell them about your fabulous diet that evening.
Yeah, I'm just going to. I had no money with me. I had enough money to buy a Coke and a chocolate bar, and that's all I had till next morning. And next morning, by the way, the wind was still blowing, but I went to the instructor and said, "Look, I don't think the wind's going to go down. Let's get this mission over." So he finally agreed. We went and did the ride, and I passed, and I went home. Boy, was I a happy camper. The only other time I spent the night in the bush, I was working at a lodge 45 miles northwest of Otter Lake. And anyway, this guy wanted a fridge, coal oil fridge moved. So I went over there and went to Laurence to pick this thing up, but I tried to get it in the airplane. It wouldn't fit. So the only other choice was to take the doors off and put the fridge in there crossways, and there was about a foot sticking out on each side, and fly it home with the doors off. But I wasted so much time. By the time I got airborne, we'd had a summer kind of like this one, and it was very smoky. And I knew I was only about 10 miles from camp I was going, but it was getting dark and smoky, and I had no clue where I was. And I didn't have a lot of fuel. So I landed and I spent the night on the lake. And of all times to have that happen, I had to do it when the doors were off the airplane. And if you think the mosquitoes didn't get a feast on me that night, you're crazy. But that was it. That was the only times I had to spend the night in the bush. Fortunately, one of the things that always concerned me was having to have somebody else come and find me. So that I made sure that didn't happen to the best of my ability, and nobody ever had to. I always managed to get myself home. There was times I had damaged airplanes even, and I was, with my aviation or my mechanical background, I was able to patch the airplane up and get it home. That happened numerous times where most pilots would have just called home and said, "Send some engineers and some parts because I'm done." But I didn't give in that easy.
Not stubborn at all. Not stubborn at all. Other questions?
Yes.
So I know there is an albatross, in that airplane. So was there ever a Gooney Bird, or how did that name originally get hung on at DC-3?
It's just a nickname.
Just nickname, so you don't know where it came from.
Yeah, no, just a nickname.
And my second question is, obviously, your second book is gonna be MOT should have had my ass.
Mhm.
You know what? If there's a second book, there's gonna be a blue moon in the sky.
Oh, should we tell them the process of the extra pages? No?
Sure.
Between 2024 and 20 and this last year, this last spring, as I said, I sent Dorrin home with some homework saying, please add this and tell us about this and we need this. And then he had sent this and then we sent it to Mary and a couple of other people. And the feedback was, we need more, we need it, you know, kind of reconfigured this way. So Dorrin went back to his humble abode and with Paulette, I'm sure just cringing, he wrote by hand, he wrote the book by hand in printed letters, which is phenomenal. Then he wrote another probably 300 pages. I think it's 276, and some of them were double numbered. So there's at least 300 handwritten pages, which he gave to me. So I spent probably a month trying to figure out between the typed document and the new document, which stories were in there and which were repeats and which were new and where do they fit and how do you spell that person's name and how do you, did you know Turner Lake? There's 3 different spellings for Turner in this province. That's interesting. So yeah, I did a lot of the research on that and we were most concerned. We apologized in advance to anybody whose name we spelled incorrectly. Other story that we wanted to tell was about flying water, dropping water.
Okay. One of the things you have
Oh,
to.
wait, yeah, one more question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
There's this thing called Alzheimer's. Did you have lots of there's a thing. Did you have lots of diaries over the year, or how the hell do you remember all this stuff?
I don't know. You know, the strange thing is, I remember a lot of these stories. I can remember the registration of almost every airplane I ever flew, but yet I can't remember my own kids' birthdays. Sorry. Everybody's brain works differently, and that's mine.
It's a fascinating pilot thing. I think when I interviewed Reg, who's 103, like he can tell you details about planes and pilots and the weights of things and how many servicemen there were and the books that he's read. But what did he have for breakfast? Not important. So I think we compartmentalize according to what's really significant to us. And I'm grateful that Dorrin was able to recount that in such detail. Because I don't think I know I couldn't do that with my life.
So obviously, you know, in the old days as to what your class of pilots could do, what you can't do now. What is the scariest thing that you ever did that, you know, you should have shit your pants or whatever?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer. The scariest moments of my life were getting to and from the airport. In the actual airplane, I mean, I can't say that I didn't scare myself a few times, but I've had, for every time I've scared myself in an airplane, I've scared myself 500 times in a car.
Really?
Without question. I mean, there was very, you know, I mean, this is one of the questions Deana kept asking. Well, that happened. What were you thinking? How were you scared or whatever? You know what? 9 times out of 10, or maybe 10 times out of 10, when something spooky did happen, you had no time to react, no time to think about that stuff. Either you reacted and did the right thing, or you crashed. And I always chose to do the right thing. You know, a typical example is engine failures. I wasn't into my aviation career very long. I think I had about 40 hours and I had my first massive engine failure. I mean, that thing quit cold and it wasn't going to run again. And I managed to get the airplane down in one piece. And I started thinking about this. You know, this is something we train in when we're getting our license, but it's something we need to be better at. So every airplane I ever flew after that, I mean, you shut the engine off anytime you want, and I knew exactly how far I could get, and I could also land it with no power. That was important to me. And when I became a training officer, that's something I always insisted on people being able to do before they were going to work for me or fly for me or go solo or whatever. So
we didn't talk about that much. We didn't talk about, besides being a maintenance engineer and a pilot, you were chief pilot, you had staff working for you and with you.
Yeah.
You had many, many roles, instructor, training officer, like all of those things as well.
Yeah, well, as a basic instructor, I only ever did that prior to getting my commercial license. I did that illegally as well. Working for a guy by the name of Howdy McPhail in Battleford.
Legend in his own.
Yeah, he's another guy. He is legendary. I mean, he flew Lancasters as Reg during World War II and shot down and all the above. And he was a great guy and a great mentor in many respects, except rules didn't mean a whole lot to him. I mean, I went to work for him first winter I ever worked in aviation, actually, and I was there to gas the airplanes and sweep the hangar floor. Well, next thing I know, I'm instructing students, and I instructed 10 people how to fly that winter, but I never did do initial flying thereafter. My kind of training was always advanced training, type checks or instrument flying or twin engine flying, something of that nature. Any more questions? Yes.
There's a couple.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, what or who was the strangest person or animal that you came across in the north?
I got to think about that one.
Okay.
I ran into lots of strange people. You know, some of the white trappers that I met when I first went into the north. I mean, oftentimes it took a half a bottle of rum. But when you got the story out of those people, it was fantastic. You know, I met one guy on Cree Lake. In the wintertime, we used to plan overnight trips with the Department of Natural Resources, and they always felt the same way as I did. You know, this is an excuse to spend the night with this guy. We'll do that and give him a half a bottle of rum, which he really enjoyed, and then get his stories. And he actually come to Canada under somewhat dubious circumstances. Nobody ever did find out the truth, but I personally think he was embarrassed the family or something and got kicked out of the country. And he kept going until he paddled his way to Cree Lake from the Big River. I mean, if you look at a map, it took them 2 months to paddle that route. And he went up there and he made that his home. And he was such a character. I can remember one of the last things that I did with him when I lived at Buffalo Narrows is I asked him one day, I said, you know, how are you making a living? Because, you know, he always had lots of groceries and seemed to live okay in his little cabin up north. And, by this time he was too old to trap or fish, so he hadn't been fishing while I was there. So I didn't know where his income was coming from. He said, well, I saved a few dollars. I said, oh, good. I said, you're not living on your pension? He said, what's a pension? I said, well, there's such a thing as an old age pension. He said, oh, really? Well, he was at that point in time right around 70. So I went down to the post office and got the forms and filled them out for him, and he got all that back pay. I was his best friend. But characters, animals, I mean, I've seen so many strange things. I was going to La Ronge one day with a brand new Cessna 180 pilot from Prince Albert. And he was flying, and I was in the process of checking him out. We got up around Montreal Lake, and the weather got kind of sour. So I could tell he was getting pretty fidgety. So I said, if you were by yourself, what would you do? He said, I'd turn around and go back to Prince Albert. I said, good answer. I said, now land this thing. So he landed, and I said, let me get in your seat. So I crawled in the left-hand seat. I said, I'm going to try, because I said, I know some routes to get there in bad weather that you will know about. So, because I knew some rivers to follow, because the visibility was really bad, and the ceiling wasn't much over about 100 feet or something. So we were flying down this river, and what do I spot? A white moose. Well, who ever saw a white moose before? So I did one circle back to try and find this thing, and I couldn't find it again. So I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But a month or so later, I was in the bar in Orange. Sure enough, a couple native trappers next table over started talking. Or no, I was telling a couple pilots about this story, and these native trappers overheard me, and one guy go over said, yes. He said, there is a white moose in that country. He said, I've been trying to get him for 4 years, but I still haven't got him.
Yeah.
All kinds of strange things. But the people were special. Even the American tourists. I mean, I met some of the most interesting people up here from the States that you can imagine. At one point in time, and this story is in the book, I met an American that flew fighters during. By the way, I'll just back up a little bit. I was taxiing out with this load of guests. And one of the typical questions that's asked is, anybody else in this airplane be able to fly this thing if that old guy drop dead on us? And you don't take exception to them. It's something that concerns people. It's a one pilot airplane. So the guy sitting beside me said, yeah, I said, I could get it down. So I said, were you a pilot? He said, well, I used to be. I said, what do you mean used to be? He said, well, I flew fighters during World War II. And I was shot down, held prisoner of war. Ooh, this is good stuff. I want to talk to him. But the flight was short, the airplane's noisy, so we weren't able to talk during the rest of the trip. The next day, the same thing happened with a load of Canadians. And the guy sitting beside me tells me the same story. He said, the only thing, by the way, he had an accent. And I knew what it was too. It was a German accent. And he admitted the fact that he had flew for the Luftwaffe during World War II and he'd been shot down in Alberta. So I'm thinking, oh boy, I really got to talk to this guy. Saturday night after we had our normal banquet, which was the last day of fishing at that lodge, I walked out on the step and this Canadian comes out. So I started asking him questions and he started telling me a story. And quite honestly, his reaction told me that very few people had ever heard his story before. For the obvious reason, he flew for the Germans. Anyway, out comes this American, and we had 40 guests in camp, and they didn't all know one another. And I knew these two had never had anything to do to one another, so I introduced them. I said, "You guys got a lot in common." "Oh, really?" I said, "Yeah, you both flew white fighters during World War II. You were both shot down, both held prisoner of war." And the American was very thankful to meet this guy. That was at 7 o'clock. 2 o'clock in the morning, they were sitting on the floor over in the corner of the bar, still talking. And the next day they told me they figured out they fought in some of the same battles on the same day. So this is the kind of people that I run into. And I got some stories out of both of them, but only a few, and they were great. Yeah.
Is it true that the DC-3 is the safest airplane in the world? Flew more people, more miles than any other airplane?
It has that reputation. Yes, when you look online about a DC-3, it's one of the safest and most efficient.
Yeah, and not without looking at the statistics, I would have to agree, because one of the things, that airplane was built so it would land and take off fairly low speed, and it was very well built. There was, I mean, every airliner out there now has had some catastrophic failure of one kind or another. The only catastrophic failure they ever had with the DC-3, to my knowledge, was they did find some cracking in the wings years ago, but proper maintenance looked after that 100%. And the DC-3 was actually overbuilt, because back when they built the DC-3, old man Douglas went to his engineers and said, "Okay, tell me what the safety margin. Tell me what the safety margin is on this airplane. Tell me what the parameters are, how thick the skins are, how thick the ribs are, how far apart the ribs are." So when they told us, he said, "No, I want all of this tripled. I want, if a 10,000 of an inch skin is satisfactory, I want 30,000s on it," as an example. The undercarriage was far overbuilt. I mean, you really had to be a dummy to knock the gear off a DC-3. So as a result, the DC-3, some of them put in a lot of hours with very few failures, and if they were, it was self-induced.
Well, and it's used for military and for, private and for passengers, like for many, many uses.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's the first airplane that made money.
It is.
Yeah, I
Passengers.
believe so. Yes.
Yeah, the DC-2 actually was the first airplane that really made money for the airlines, and they were well into the DC-3, or DC-2 rather. But one of the airlines, I can't remember which one it was, they went to old man Douglas and said, "Look, we want an airplane that holds 5 or 6 more people and can haul a little bit more weight. We want." So he said, "Well, why should I build that?" He said, "The DC-2 is very successful and we got a backlog of orders." He said, "Well, if you'll build the airplane that specs," he said, "I'll give you the money right now for 10 airplanes. And he sat down and wrote Douglas a check for those airplanes. So he did decide to build the airplane. And of course, that was just prior to World War II, and the military come along and they wanted the DC-3/C-47. So they ordered thousands more. And it has an incredible history, and it is an incredible airplane.
When was it stopped being in use in Canada?
I'm not sure that's happened yet.
Okay,
I think Buffalo Joe's still running one, but I'm not sure.
okay.
If he isn't, it would have been just recently that
And
they
the one
stopped.
in front of the Aviation Museum,
That airplane stopped flying in 1995.
and you flew that one.
I did.
Mhm. So if you want to see a DC-3 that this guy flew, it's at the Aviation Museum outside.
That particular airplane that's on the cover of the
Mhm.
book is it.
Yeah, our dad was in the Air Force during the war and then after the war. He had a favorite saying. He says, you can tell a pilot, but you can't tell him much. And one of my favorite,
Laughing.
That's Dorrin's wife that you hear laughing.
one of my favorite pilots ever was Brent Eichel, who loved flying the DC-3 and then went to Toronto to fly 737s to Jamaica. And the last time he said goodbye to me, he said, I said, you're going to miss flying this airplane. And he says, I know it. I'm going to miss flying it, but I won't miss loading it.
No, that's it.
And then he came back. Would you like to comment on what happened to Brent Eichel or?
No, I don't.
Okay, you won't. That's fine. Any stories about Alex Robinson?
Who?
Alex Robertson up in,
I don't know him that well.
but you didn't know them that well.
No,
Okay.
I really didn't. I knew of them, but I didn't know them that well.
And then do you have a couple of stories about the PBY? Was it a favorite aircraft of yours or not?
Yeah, I got a good one.
One story.
One story?
Yep.
Okay. The PBY was a amphibious airplane that was designed to be used during search and rescue and to escort convoys across places like the North Atlantic during World War II when the German submarines were knocking so many ships down. Now, these airplanes after World War II come into commercial service and were used for all kinds of things. And I got to fly them as water bombers, and they operated as water bombers in Saskatchewan.
That's Catalina we're talking
Yeah.
about, right?
Yeah.
Look at me learning about airplanes. Just point that out. I was sorry.
For at least 30 to 40 years, they flew as water bombers, and they were a great airplane. They were built much like the DC-3. I mean, they were almost indestructible. My best story about a DC-3 is, or a council rather, is people always questioned whether you could hit something with a load of water. They just couldn't visualize the fact that you could hit a target. And of course, many times I was asked to put on demonstrations. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. I tended to hate them because if you missed, you really looked bad. And you give them all kinds of fodder. But at any rate, there was one guy in the range always give me a hard time about this. And he told me the government was wasting money hiring us and all the rest of it. And I kept saying to him, Ted, one day you're going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And of course, he just laughed at me. So one day when I was stationed up there, we got called to a fire, and I had just had coffee with him and Vic Todosenko. You remember Vic? Worked for Narcan Air. And they were going out to their cabin. So I asked him where their cabin was. So he told me where the cabin was. So lo and behold, this fire was right on the other side of their cabin, about 20 miles. So I flew over there and I found the cabin and I memorized a few landmarks around there. And I went out, spent 4 hours water bombing this fire, put it out. So I said, to go about the fire's out. We don't need any more. I said, we're going to pick up one more load of water. He said, what for? I said, you'll see. So we turned around and come back. And I made one pass over top of the cabin, and it was in 100-foot trees. So I had to go by my landmarks and hope that I hit them. Anyway, I punched the load off, and I stayed pretty high because I didn't want to hurt anybody. And I kicked the tail sideways, and I looked, and I got them dead to rights. But guess what? There was somebody standing on the roof of the cabin. Unbeknownst to me, they were shingling the cabin. Anyway, the next day I met with coffee again, and this guy now he's mad at me. He said, you just about killed me. You knocked all the shingles off the cabin, and you pretty near washed me off there. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you know what I'm talking about. I said, no, I don't, because there was 2 airplanes in the garage. And the other one was flown by a guy that was very notorious for doing tricks like that. And everybody owed him one. And I did too. So anyway, I led him to believe that it was the other guy. So this wasn't quite the end of the story. By the way, I give this guy a pretty hard time about us being able to hit. And I said, okay, you proved your point. But anyway,
You have to buy the book to get the end of the story.
yeah,
There you go. There you go.
December that year, this Ted guy, he was a local contractor. He was driving down the street with his forklift, and this guy that I kind of blamed for doing the dirty deed drove up to the post office with his old jalopy car, and Ted drove by and oops, he turned and run the forklift out of the car, lifted it at the top, turned the key off and went for coffee. Well, he come back a half an hour later and this pilot, his name's Dale, he's up there. What's going on here? Well, you know what's going on. So they had an argument back and forth. Anyway, he finally went to let him down and the car fell off the forklift off over the fence onto the post office steps, and he drove away and left him there.
Thank you very much for your attention tonight, and we hope you enjoyed Dorrin's stories. And we'd love to sign some books for you. Thank you, McNally Robinson.
Yeah, thank you very much.